change is a human activity that we experience every second of the day, and it's the context that adds the spice level for the change. Context is everything. Context, context, context. While I believe culture is king, so is context. If you do not add context in your conversations, in your transformation initiatives, in your learning models, in everything that you're doing, we will continue to have misunderstanding after misunderstanding after misunderstanding, failed project after failed project after failed project. Context adds the spice level to the change. Okay. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bonus Bites. This is part 2 of talking about digital transformation, ROI, technology investments. And the first part we really went through looking at the PwC survey. We were looking at the critical challenges that the 609 executives across 6 sectors in the US reported as being their most critical challenges in terms of their strategic planning and how they were going to overcome them. So we dug into that in part 1. So I highly suggest if you're popping in now, go back and check out what we were talking about for critical challenges. In this part, what we want to do is kind of look at, again, the key call-outs. They had some immediate things to explore, but I want to talk more on the multidimensional change methodology and kind of dip our toes into that pond a little bit, because this is a very extensive topic, as you'll see as we continue to make content for you. We've got lots and lots to share over the work done from the last 10 years and how that can really help you in the now moment, in today, and being future forward, and really surviving the overall paradigm shift. And not just surviving it, but thriving in it and being part of that paradigm shift versus just running to catch up and hope you don't fall flat on your face in the meantime. Always what I worry about. Okay, so let's get started. So going right back into it, we mentioned that digital transformation heavily relies on organizational culture to be successful. We mentioned again early on about organizational culture, and let's explain it for you if you have not seen part 2 yet. Organizational culture is the values and behaviors that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organization. It is the ethos, values, and frameworks for how a company conducts itself internally and externally. It includes core values, expectations for behavior, decision-making frameworks, how information flows through the organization, and how it conducts itself with others. Great. So now that we kind of understand it's a whole, the organization itself, which an organization is just a few people, and it could be an enterprise system. It's where a few people come together and organize for work or organize towards an end goal. That could be a community project. It could be this massive enterprise global organization and anything in between. Okay. So when we understand that, it really helps us to understand that without cultural frameworks, without the right processes, without it documented and the talent in place to even operate a cultural model the way you need it to operate, or your technologies in this frame of thinking that we're going with, without that, you cannot generate the value that you're seeking to generate, whether it be from a financial perspective, the ROI on that investment, or the value of the people that you have in place to contribute, and how that ultimately meets the end goal that you have in terms of your impact in the world, whatever that looks like for you. Without those things in place, even your best technology will go to waste. There will be no value generation, or it will be very, very little, and very, very little ROI on your investment, if at all, if you don't have these things in place. There is a formula. This is not new information. I myself have been talking about it and calling it out since 2017 in our work with the Open Organization Project. This is not new information. We've been talking about failure rates and change management for a couple of decades, staying at 70%. And I believe the first, ask me to recall my memory right now, it's a little tricky, but I want to say the very first time that number popped up was research done in the early 80s. Okay, so we're talking about decades. We've been holding at 70% for change failure rates and change management, and it's tracking consistently when you look at digital transformation initiatives. Change is change. It's a human-centric process. It is a multidimensional process, and it's driven by people. Okay. So this is a holistic issue that we have. It is not isolated to implementing AI. It's not isolated to Web3. It's not isolated to the Internet of Things. It's not isolated in just this digital channel. Okay. It is a holistic issue and a holistic problem. It's impacting everybody. Because if you're having a 70% failure rate where you're investing a lot of your money at an enterprise wide scale, we mentioned in the last video that it's at 27.5 million at an enterprise level annually into technology. So that's a pretty significant number to know that you're just consistently going to throw that money away instead of stopping and thinking about a holistic approach methodology that can be implemented at every level of your organization that allows for transformation to happen in a more intuitive, adaptable way. It also is very much more inclusive and allows everything to be interoperable, which we talked about in the first video, so you can go back to part one for that. So let's go back to these key topics. One of them was mentioned around changing operating models to align with the new vision. One of the things that we'd point out here is that process and workflow changes are necessary before implementing new technologies. There are very quick ways to do that. One of the ways that we've successfully done this ourselves when working with clients is running what we like to call co-lab. It's a workshop, it's a brainstorm session, it's an innovation lab, combination of all these things. However, the way that we do it differently and then teach other people how to do that is that environment needs to be one, interactive. It needs to be inclusive. You need to have the right people at the table. The people that are at the table need to have the autonomy to speak freely. It needs to be a very safe, psychologically safe environment while you run a session like this, or you're not going to get honest feedback. You're not going to know where the blocks and barriers exist without that being set up. Also, the way we do it and which again is very easy to replicate once you know what you're doing, is we create an interactive applied learning method. So you're brainstorming and solving solutions. We're finding where blocks and barriers are. We're identifying capabilities and capacities, either deficits, kind of auditing that scope. Again, this goes back to trapped and untapped value. That's something that Leader 21, it's been my personal thing around trapped and untapped value that's been out there that I've utilized in other projects. And then I've tested that and kind of worked this into a capabilities and capacities methodology, if you will. And then while we're actively working on brainstorming or strategy planning or problem solving, identifying problems, blocks, barriers to growth, to sustainability, to optimization, we're actively doing it in a way where people are learning open collaboration, they're learning open practices, and they're learning behaviors and ways to model that. So when they go back out, you see how they're trained up and how to do the thing, how they are implementing that both in their individual way, but also with their teams and within their departments. So creating a safe place for that to happen and for innovation to take place, you can go through those and look at your processes and your workflow changes by running those types of like, again, I call it trapped and untapped value, but running your audits to know where the blocks and barriers are so that you can modify and adjust your processes and your workflows to meet the demands and align to the vision that's being set with the new technology implementation or the new direction that your business is shifting to, even if it's cultural. So again, all of these things are together. Transformation is transformation. Change is change. The methodologies, the concepts apply in all different ways across the board. It's irrelevant on sector, it's irrelevant on any of it. There are modifications that are made based on that sector. For example, you may have something that's more regulated type of industry. So there are things that you'd modify slightly. And those are kind of like little levers that go up and down. You kind of dial them up, you dial them down to meet the demand of where you're at. But at the end of the day, these things are interchangeable, interoperable. It just comes down to the understanding and the language. The last video we referred to this kind of almost like a dialect. We're talking the same language, but we've got a slightly different dialect or slightly different word choice. And so because my business terminology in one channel is different than business terminology in a different channel, but we're saying the same thing. And this is where the bulk of confusion year after year lab after lab, hundreds and hundreds of C-level execs and senior level people that I've worked with. It comes down to the same problem. Nobody understands the other person. We're all saying the same thing with a slightly different word choice, which is why I love using metaphors and concepts for people to understand what we're actually talking about. So that's changing operating models and aligning with your new vision. The next core issue they were talking about was training existing talent on new technologies and reskilling. You can incorporate various learning methods with this. I just mentioned one in the way that we structure collabs and to teach other people how to do that. It's a different learning model. It has to be interactive. We have to be moving. People also have to have different types of ways of learning. You have neurotypical people, you have neurodivergent people. We just have different ways that our brains operate. That means the way we process the information, the way that we understand it, the way we take it in needs to be done differently. So looking at different models for this, I myself have learned a lot about this recently because I didn't understand my brain type. As I've leaned into understanding what my brain type is, with my neurodivergence, I'm able to understand we need more dopamine. Okay. Our brain doesn't produce as much dopamine as it does in a neurotypical brain. So we're always looking for hits of dopamine. So it's not an inattention to details and learning, for example. It's not that nobody struggles with attention. It's not an attention span issue. It's whether you've caught my attention, whether I find this interesting and is it giving me a dopamine hit. So understanding the differences in brain types and learning types. And then I think also doing it in more interactive, collaborative, problem solving way is very important. Like we talked about modeling it through a collab environment. But I think it also comes down to there's like another layer to that, right? What is the burden that's already being put on people? How overwhelmed are people already with meeting needs? How are we looking at this more holistically in that constant way that people are learning? By the way, transformation is learning, change is learning. It's all different facets, again, of the same thing, different perspectives, different facets of the same thing. So, learning as well needs to take into account again, the overwhelming nature of where the individual is. So that might look like um, doing micro lessons because they only have a short amount of time to take something in versus an extended period of time for a workshop. Or maybe that is the right model for somebody to have a break to get away. So these are just considerations when looking at what's right for you and your organization and your decision-making models. It also may look like having more accessibility in your learning content. Again, I mentioned the difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent brains and the need for it to be stimulating, the need for it to hit dopamine levels up, the need for it to be engaging and entertaining, for it to be, and entertaining doesn't mean you have to clown around, right? It can be, it's just thoughtful. I have spent an ungodly amount of hours falling down rabbit holes to find out information about things I'm passionate about. Um, but if it doesn't grab me, if it's not providing value back initially, then yes, I skip to the next content creator. The same thing can apply here, right? So, does it need to be audio right now? I went through a period of time where reading just wasn't like I couldn't do it. I couldn't allow myself to focus and retain information, but I can put audio in. I can listen to it in a podcast style. I can listen to the conversations that are taking place. I can use it as background while I'm doing other things, but I'm still actively learning and processing new information and details. So think about the accessibility factor, think about the different models. Um, there's no reason that we cannot take the same concepts that are being delivered in social media content delivery platforms. If you look at Reels, TikToks, YouTubes, um, podcast, how is content being delivered and consumed? How can that apply for us at an internal level so that we can modify how we're doing learning in the modern era? And I think that's really, really important to think about as people that are developing what that looks like for a company. Next, allow for cross-functional collaboration models and project collaboration. This is going to go back to your organizational frameworks. This goes back to processes, governance models, how that is happening, how it's taking place, how it's being allowed. This is going to be something you will learn from me as capacity. You may have all of the capability sitting in your organization and you have no capacity to execute on it. This is the part that I find that trapped and untapped value exists in is capacities. We do not set our organizations up for success. We can have all the capacity, all of the power generation, all of the best talent in the world, all of the best idea banks sitting there. But if you do not have the cultural frameworks and operational processes to execute those capabilities, your capacity does not allow for it, then so figure that one out too. That's another big place that we help you focus on getting into. The third thing I wanted to point out was know how your people contribute best and make your contributions visible. This is actually very, very significant in contribution. So I think one of the things that really, I was very vocal about it within the open organization community and within open knowledge communities. I reached out to a lot of people. I asked people that were heading up OSPOs. I talked to people that were doing other open source projects. And I wanted to really dig into what I perceived. And I know I wasn't alone in it, but there has not yet been an answer. But I was really, really, really um, ticked off and offended by how contributors within the open source world are both highlighted for their contribution, how they're remunerated for contribution. Contributions are not necessarily made visible. And I'm not trying to be on a platform to say every individual has to have a thing. If you're part of a community, it's about the we, not the me. Like, yes, there are facets to that, but there are also that leaves up, and there's nothing wrong with the ideology around that, right? Creating a me, it's a we over a me. But when you dig under that, the structural framework to make that happen, it leaves open a lot of room for interpretation and a lot of room for people to be taken advantage of. I myself experienced that where I was contributing basically the same as a part-time job. I was contributing back into my community model and running, I mean, high level stuff. And then I wasn't getting I wasn't getting an exchange back in a way that was healthy for me, right? Again, there's a variety of factors that go into that, but that led me down the pathway of going, okay, everybody contributes differently. We work with change differently, we process information differently, and our skills are different. Our learning agility kind of dials can also look a little differently. So when you look at this as how a human is contributing, instead of saying I've employed a person, is how is this person contributing in my organization? What contributions can they contribute that we're not even tapping into, right? That's that untapped value within your talent that we haven't even expressed yet, and often can be hard for people. I personally have the hardest time explaining to people what it is I do because I am a multi-potentialite. I am extremely well versed in multiple areas and aspects. I hold a huge amount of information in my brain, knowledge, everything from random things pop culturally to deep dives of how you do things to just the other things I'm passionate about, right? So my expressions of that are vast. As humans, we're able to express a vast amount of knowledge, information, ways of doing things, creativity, innovation, but a lot of that's been suppressed in order to fit the cubicle, right? The idea of this is what you fit, this is your job role, this is what we're paying you to do. Don't step outside your swim lane. Don't do it. Don't do it. But what we've done by that, not looking at the human centricity, these superpowers of humans, the way that our brain differences work and the value that that brings to the table, um, we're not, those contributions are not seen. They're not being remunerated. I love that word. I get stuck on it frequently. And then also, we're not looking at the visibility. So, if we're not collecting the data, if we don't know how and where those contributions are being done, remember that we're in a very distributed place in the world now. We look at things from a remote work to how we work with global teams across our organization. And then, if we look at also decentralization and the rise with decentralization, that will continue and how that will shift and change the way we operate and work. We have to be able to have systems in place that allow us to track and look at contribution visibility, what the contributions actually are, which will then allow us to problem solve very differently. This can actually solve, and we talked a lot about this in Book Mesh, and I'll put a link for that down below. But we talked a lot about this in terms of the concepts for decentralization and why it's going to be important to continue to focus on that. And then finally, on this point, we'll talk about getting out of siloed thinking, that people are not widely skilled in learning agile. Again, this goes back to being more inclusive, to understanding what are your contributions, what are your skill sets, what else do you bring to the table that could be applied knowledge and learning from other things. I personally have experienced this, that this is very much overlooked in even just how we personally see ourselves, let alone how the organization that we're talking with or working within may perceive us. Um, but for me, my transformation, knowledge and wisdom and understanding and applications began as a child because I moved frequently as a child. And I was always in a new place, learning a new community, learning a new way of being within that community, needing to meet new people. And because that was done in different locations around the United States, there's subcultures all over the US, right? Both in dialect, in word choices, in behaviors. And so I was being inundated into that space very, very, very early on. So I have decades of knowledge about human behavior and transformation and change and adaptability, right? And inclusivity or exclusivity, what those models can look like. And I think that that's frequently overlooked when I'm having conversations with people. If you're just looking at me on a piece of paper, is what I mean. And you'd be like, well, but you didn't have this particular title and you didn't have this particular role and you didn't have this, you bounced between channels. You weren't in one channel for your whole career. No, I haven't. I actually can tell you multiple things. I have a widespread, holistic view of what's going on because I've had experience in these different pockets of things. I understand the connections. And by the way, I bring decades prior to even entering the workforce of transformation and what it looks like in human behavior. So that's just one example, is we have to get out of that siloed thinking. We have to look at people in a very different way for contributions, for learning agility, and having the right cultural frameworks for people to operate with more autonomy and to be able to contribute with more autonomy and to look at open and cross-functional collaborational models in order to do that. This will greatly shift your approach to reskilling. Again, I would also point back to what I was referencing for like a collab, like collaborative environments that are structured in a way to both solve problems and learn modeled behaviors and examples in real time. Like layering and scaffolding it that way allows you to quickly reskill people and to learn new behaviors that they're modeling that you need for functioning in your culture the way you need in your organization and your operating models. You're modeling that at the same time as problem solving and learning. And so creating a different model and methodology for it and being more modernized in the approach in general is really, really important here. So the next point was poor succession planning. And we look at that as aligning your strategic planning and succession plans with more liberated organizational structures. One of the things that I want to point out there is I use the word liberated a lot because I feel that there's a lot of confusion around the word open. Um, I get I get booted out even within the open source community if I don't use a very specific term. This literally just happened last week, by the way. So I was told that my foundational knowledge of open source and open methodologies was not in my article enough, was not pointed out. When I'm part of the group and community that defined it, that led that wrote that created maturity models, that wrote the books on it. It's embedded in everything that I do, who I am, how I work with people. So again, there's this misalignment in language. I also think that liberated helps embody a little bit more around distributed and decentralized. Often if I use the word decentralized, immediately the jump to is, DAOs, Web3, decentralization in terms of decision making, and we're missing more than that. It is just it's activities. It could be distributed leadership. There's like facets to this. Right? Everything is faceted and multidimensional. And so I've gone with the term liberated because we're talking about more free and open concepts. and structures that go with that. It also would be aligning that, having strategic planning models, looking at systems thinking for holistic overview. So you want to be able to look across the width of the landscape and the breadth of it and the depth of it. It's not, it's having a completely different perspective and view on that that needs to happen. Utilizing systems thinking for your aligning your strategic planning and your succession plans, having a more holistic component to them. What we just talked about as well is contribution visibility can actually make for huge strides in your succession planning. If you know where contribution is and all of the facets to that, and it's visible and you can collect that data, you can then do your succession planning in a much more integrated, holistic way that is aligned with your overall strategies that you have as an organization. And you'll find that this crosswalking becomes much easier as people start to live and breathe this methodology for change and transformation and being more human centric and holistic and modernizing it in a way where you're utilizing your data gathering and your business intelligence, and you're actually utilizing it in a different component, different way. It very easily allows you then to this becomes a fluid movement eventually, is what my point to this is. All of this becomes fluid because your information flow is flowing. It's the same like the body. If the energy portals are open, the meridians are open, and you're not blocked and clogged and stuck, then the information flow, the energy flows, the information flows. It goes, it goes, it goes, right? This begins to happen, and we see it happen in nature, it happens in humanity, it happens in an organization. It's just which microcosm are you looking at? Same thing being modeled across the board, different languages for each piece. Okay, company culture is not conducive to innovation. Couple quick points on this one. Really, it's about open behaviors, practices, models, characteristics. They're not just for open source software development. They've been well documented, practiced, and implemented as open organization and culture in companies across the world, both private, public sectors. Again, I'm going to point back to MESH, concept and methodology, because when we worked on that for a period of time before I even, with my co-author, integrated the components into this model, already been studying open behaviors and wrote a lot about open behaviors and what they look like and how they're manifested and how they engage and interact with operational behaviors. So open was missing a few extra pieces. And it's not that open was missing anything. Let me rephrase that. Open wasn't missing anything per se. I just felt like I am a more expansive viewpoint. I see the holistic component. I know that there's more than just open that needs to be present. So in mesh methodology, we looked at things like those conditions, which I'll mention here in just a moment. We looked at the multidimensionality. We looked at the other factors that need to be in place. So for example, we can look at the 5 open characteristics, but I would say, well, where does trust fit in? Because we need trust. We need psychological safety. We need reliability. We need trust between leaders, each other. There's other factors, but we didn't really know where that would fit. Is it a byproduct? Is it this or that? And so for us, trust is a critical component to all of this. So it's like open plus, right? That's how we ended up coming with mesh, is we looked at all of these other components and conditions that need to be an integral part as well as open in order to have a holistic multidimensional approach to transformation, to your organizational culture, and building a better world ultimately. Lack of buy-in from the workforce came down to, I would suggest, engaging your workforce in that liberated decision-making process. There's an open decision-making process framework that Red Hat produced, and one of the Open Org ambassadors that I worked with was a big component in helping kind of put that forward as well. And I think that if you can look at things like that to kind of get yourself started in understanding how do we do this. But again, if you have information flow going, if your structures are there, it's well documented, people have access to it, people know it, they are living and breathing it, it's become an integrated way of doing things and way of working. This then begins to happen more easily in terms of the decision-making processes. I think also one of the biggest things that I have found in my work, and specifically in looking at like a 20-year window, is that if you're going to get buy-in, there are strategic communications and conversational tactics that need to be utilized to gain buy-in. You can gain buy-in from your stakeholders from your workers, from your community contributors and collaborators. It just requires a different set of understanding. We all have a change language that we use. We also have within that kind of trigger words of you have to kind of know how to navigate those conversations or conversational tactics that can be used and to create those crosswalks amongst different departments, groups of people, different channels. Then when you're saying we're saying the same thing, but we mean different things, or we're saying the same thing and we mean the same thing, but we're using different language and terms and words and concepts. Having understanding of how to do that, my work as a dialogue partner and cultural expert work that I did with Red Hat was very much in doing this. Not only can you gain the buy-in, but at the same time, if done the right way with the right tactics and data gathering, you can also use that to for phenomenological research and understanding with that. So the last thing we want to hit on in this particular video is just touching on the multidimensional human-centric approach. And I wanted to talk a lot about mesh here for a moment, but I'm going to try to break this down in a couple of different ways for you. So for me, my work in what I called my multidimensional change approach, which a good majority of that went into creating mesh and combined that work with my co-author. And we looked at, okay, this is really an overall concept and methodology for organizational design, development, and structure. But this is ultimately my perspective and the work I did in it. This is ultimately transformation. It's how it happens. It's understanding the different components, that this is a networked approach, that there are different nodes and clusters. Think about like fractals. Again, these are things that are replicated in nature. They're not, and then we replicate them in how we develop technology. So bringing it back to the human-centric component, doing it through that lens, this becomes much more easy to understand over time that and I'm going to show you this here. This is the concept map that we have at the beginning of our book. There are power and value generators. This will be a different video that we get into extensively, but you have to know what are the capabilities and capacities. How do those track to each of the three power sources, right? Your power generators. You have a power source, which are the people, that also be the leaders. You have a power plant, that is your operational channel, and then you have power brokers. And a power broker is your organization at large that is distributing and disseminating the power that's behind. Your power source is your core. It's the core of the people, right? What are their capabilities? What are the capacities? What are you allowing for to even happen for them to generate value, to generate the power behind that before it moves through the operational plant, power plant, which is your operational, which then goes out into the organizational system as the power broker. Understanding mindsets and behaviors, um, articulating your tenets, articulating your characteristics, and then crosswalking those into what they look like operationalized, but also just the mindsets and behaviors that have to be modeled and for your values and your characteristics, your tenets to actually be true, to be real, and to be alive. That this is, again, remember, your organization, your team, even if you go down into the subunit of that, is its own living organism. This is all connected. It's all interconnected by different nodes in the network that make up the mesh of your organization and the ecosystem. You go even beyond your own organization cell, right? And you step back out to how are we contributing to our industry? How are we contributing to the world around us? Use nature as a insight into how this all functions and works and how it can be replicated. We look at the skills. We've already talked extensively about skills. We talk about contribution, its need for visibility. Everybody has a contribution tendency that can even be modeled throughout. Again, looking at core ops global, we can go from contribution tendency at an individual level to what that looks like modeled through out. And again, that goes back to capabilities and capacity work that we do. We do audits of that, by the way. So that's something that we can help people with understand more, either teaching you how to do that and or walking with you to kind of run an audit of capabilities and capacities so that you know where you sit in the map of things, map that back out for you. We believe in the three tenets of connection, visibility, and trust. And this really goes to the fact that, we talk a lot about what that looks like in the open community or it looks like in technology. And we're looking at pulling that forward now to the tenets for what do we need now in a decentralized world, in the paradigm shifting that we're doing. How do we do it with the human-centric approach? And for us, that comes down to looking at connection, visibility, and trust. And you can see the embedded principles of open within that, and then the other pieces that we need. Um, Two of the biggest pieces of this concept and methodology really comes down to the lenses. If you're doing multidimensional transformation, you're doing transformation done right, it has to be done multidimensionally. There are three lenses that we look at information through, that we process it through. This can be done again at an individual level all the way to org wide. And the lenses look differently at an individual level. But when we're talking about organization, it's, if you're a leader in one of your different channels, these things can be modeled, but you're looking at the core, the operations, and then the global impact. It has to be filtered through three different lenses in order to have an optimized and sustainable change. Um, and lastly, I just want to touch on the conditions. I think it was in our last video, we talked about conditions a little bit, about open, but there also needs to be, those open characteristics need to be baked into there. That's the adaptability, community, inclusivity, transparency, and collaboration. We also need to understand regeneration. What are the conditions for regeneration? Are we meeting that? Then we look at balance, information flow, trust practices, awareness, learning, and sustainability. And I think awareness is a huge one that I tend to focus on. That's really about the expansion of our overall consciousness. Um, when you become aware of something, when light is shed on something that was previously not there, maybe dark, and you just weren't aware of it, right? When we shed light on that, we become aware of something. You gain new insights. And once you've seen the thing, you can't unsee the thing, right? So awareness is a massive part of learning. It's a massive part of transformation. It's just one of the most critical components of that. And that awareness, we can then go back to looking at things like information flow and visibility. Like all of these things are interconnected. Again, I feel like I cannot overstate that these are all connected. And then the final one here is sustainability. If we also understand how our individual contributors contribute, or how our departments and channels contribute, if we understand and we put that together with the capabilities, capacities component, we can both optimize and sustain. It really does come down to contributors and the cultural frameworks that we have set in place for it to work and operate. So I'm going to say this again, that transformation digitally cannot happen without the human-centric and organizational component. You will not get ROI back on your investment, and you will not generate value in your technology if you have not addressed these other parts. So as we tie this up, let's talk a little bit about what we mentioned here in this article, which again is linked down below. Change is a human activity that we experience every second of the day, and it's the context that adds the spice level for the change. Context is everything. Context, context, context. While I believe culture is king, so is context. If you do not add context in your conversations, in your transformation initiatives, in your learning models, in everything that you're doing, we will continue to have misunderstanding after misunderstanding after misunderstanding, failed project after failed project after failed project. Context adds the spice level to the change. Okay. Change is processed through four spectrums: how details are gathered, how we navigate the unknown, how we process our emotions, and how we contribute to growth. Every human will process through that, one of those spectrum filters. And depending on where you sit within that spectrum of the filter, can lean into things like how you contribute, how you can help with buy-in. There's a variety of things that we go through. I like to call it a change language. Multidimensional change happens through those three lenses: core, operational, and global. The conditions that affect and enable regenerative sustainable growth we just mentioned. I'm just going to summarize them again for you: open, regeneration, balance, information flow, trust, awareness, learning, and sustainability. Look into the reframe tenets of connection, visibility, and trust. Are going to be the three components that you need to tag yourself to for decentralized world that we live in and the paradigm shifts that are underway. We can define and articulate those in a variety of ways, but we want to kind of come back to visibility and trust. And then know where your power is being held, where it's flowing from, or blocked in your organization for effective transformation efforts. That's, again, going back to where your power sources are, capabilities, capacities, and then looking at that through the lens of, or identifying and mapping it to um, tapped, trapped, or untapped value, TUV for short. Okay. So I think that that's just really important. This really sums up what I wanted to dig into with you around the article, and kind of breaking it down into these bonus sound bites for you so that we can start to have more conversations. Um, there are a couple of things we'll do moving forward. I'm going to continue to look at these with past articles that I've written and kind of revisit a lot of the open source work that we did in the open organization. Like, how would I view the information at the time that we were reframing around that? Like, for example, with an article on reskilling in the age of AI, or our learning agility series, like, would I reframe that in 2024 with more information and context? Probably so. So I want to like be able to do that. And at this time, all of that information will be made available here on our YouTube channel. And then make sure that you subscribe, by the way, if you have not yet already, and hit the notification bell for more information. So look forward to talking to you. Thanks, guys. See you next time.